Let me take you deep into one of the most chilling and heartbreaking stories to ever unfold on Mount Everest. Picture this. It's May 15th, 2016, and the morning air at Camp 2, perched at over 21,200 feet in the vast, frozen western combe, bites like 1,000 tiny knives. The temperature hovers around -15 degrees Fahrenheit, and the camp sprawls across a broad glacial valley squeezed between the sheer, towering walls of Nuptse to the west and Lhotse to the east. Brightly colored expedition tents, the uneven ice like scattered jewels against the endless white and gray, while prayer flags flutter and snap in the relentless wind, sending silent mantras into the thin, oxygen-starved atmosphere. Among the hundreds of climbers staged there for the final push toward the summit was Derek Holden, a 38-year-old businessman from Vancouver, British Columbia. Derek had built a substantial fortune in commercial real estate, selling off a portfolio of properties just 3 years earlier that left him financially set for life. That windfall became the fuel for what he called his personal transformation. A dramatic shift from the corporate grind into a life of high-stakes adventure that he could capture, package, and share with the world. He had only taken up mountaineering about 18 months before arriving at Everest, knocking off guided climbs of Kilimanjaro, Elbrus, and Aconcagua. His Instagram following had exploded from a modest 300 to nearly 12,000 during that short time, built entirely on aspirational posts that painted him as a man boldly testing the absolute limits of human endurance. Derek's approach to climbing was more about crafting a compelling personal narrative than mastering the technical craft. He trained in a local gym, but his real-world mountaineering experience remained limited. Every ascent had been fully guided, with support staff handling every logistical detail so he could focus on the physical challenge and, more importantly, on creating content that documented his journey. Everest was supposed to be the grand finale of that story, the ultimate proof of his mental toughness and unbreakable commitment. To make it happen, he had paid well over $70,000 to join a mid-tier commercial expedition run by a company based in Kathmandu. The fee covered everything: permits, Sherpa support, oxygen, and full logistics from base camp all the way to the summit and back. His social media feed during the expedition was relentless and carefully curated. Day after day, he posted images and updates that framed his presence on the mountain as the ultimate symbol of personal grit and self-discovery. What those posts almost never showed, however, were the Sherpas whose tireless labor made his dream possible. When they did appear in his photos, carrying his heavy loads, preparing his meals, pitching his tent, they were rarely named. On the rare occasions he mentioned them at all, it was with casual, dismissive phrases like "my Sherpa" or "the porters," reducing living, breathing men with families and decades of expertise to nothing more than background support staff. Other climbers at base camp had quietly noticed the pattern, but in the chaotic world of dozens of independent expeditions, no one confronted him directly. Derek's relationship with his own assigned Sherpa team had been slowly souring from the very beginning of the trip. His lead Sherpa was Dorje Tamong, a 34-year-old veteran with 11 successful Everest summits and 15 years of high-altitude guiding experience. Dorje had grown up in the Khumbu Valley, learned the ropes from his father, and used every climbing season to provide for his extended family. Among the guiding companies, he was known as reliable, patient, and exceptionally skilled at handling the full spectrum of client personalities: the insecure, the arrogant, the terrified, and the overconfident. The first real fracture happened during the initial acclimatization rotation up to Camp 1 at 19,900 feet. Derek had been warned repeatedly that many Sherpas viewed the Khumbu Icefall as a sacred space, a deadly, ever-shifting maze of towering ice blocks and hidden crevasses where cameras simply did not belong. It was the section of the mountain where the highest number of Sherpa deaths had occurred over the decades. Brothers, fathers, and close friends had vanished there. The cultural practice was to move through it quickly and with deep respect, never treating it as a scenic backdrop for content. When Dorje tried to explain this during a rest stop between ladder crossings, Derek brushed it aside. He declared that he had paid for full access and would film whatever he wanted. He kept the camera rolling, capturing raw footage of Sherpas hauling massive loads through the most dangerous stretches of the icefall. Later, that same footage appeared in one of his video posts, framed as the chaos and disorganization he had witnessed, with zero mention of the cultural sensitivity Dorje had tried to convey. The post racked up hundreds of admiring comments praising Derek's bravery and honesty. None of those followers had any idea they were watching material that directly violated the protocols George had explicitly laid out. The second incident took place back at Camp 2 on arrest day. Derek was sitting inside the mess tent editing photos on his laptop when George walked in to discuss the next day's schedule. Without even looking up from his screen, Derek ordered George to bring him coffee. The request itself wasn't unusual. Sherpas routinely prepared food and drinks for clients as part of the service, but the tone was pure command, cold and entitled. Several other Sherpas in the tent witnessed the exchange, and the dismissive manner in which it was delivered sent ripples through the group. George prepared the coffee without a word, but the story spread like wildfire through the Sherpa network at base camp within hours. Then came the third incident, one that struck deeper than any of the others. Derek posted a photo of himself at Camp 2 with the massive Lhotse face looming behind him. The caption celebrated his progress as a purely personal triumph forged through months of training and mental preparation. Not a single word acknowledged the Sherpas who had carried 70% of his equipment to that altitude, built the camp infrastructure, or spent 2 grueling weeks fixing the very ropes visible in the background of his shot. Climbers who knew George's team later said that post ignited real fury, not because credit was merely omitted, but because it actively erased the labor that made the entire climb possible. By early May, Derek's behavior had become common knowledge among Sherpa teams across multiple expeditions. The Sherpa community on Everest functions like a tight-knit, lightning-fast network. Guides from different companies train together, share equipment, coordinate rescues, and carry reputations from season to season. Within that invisible web, Derek was earning a reputation as someone who showed consistent, accumulating disrespect, not through one explosive moment, but through 1,000 small cuts that revealed exactly how little value he placed on the human beings keeping him alive. The breaking point arrived on the morning of May 15th. The day before, Derek had pushed up to around 23,000 feet on the Lhotse face as part of his final acclimatization rotation. It had been brutal 3 hours of front-pointing up steep blue ice while clipped to fixed ropes, stopping every few steps to suck in the thin air that held barely 40% of sea-level oxygen. He had returned to Camp 2 in the early afternoon, legs shaking, fingers numb, utterly spent but visibly proud of himself. That evening, after crawling into his sleeping bag and choking down a freeze-dried meal, he uploaded a new photo of himself on the fixed ropes. The caption highlighted the technical difficulty of the climbing and his growing confidence. Then came the sentence that would change everything. He claimed he had personally installed sections of rope himself to ensure proper placement after noticing questionable anchors on the lower face. It was a complete and utter lie. Every inch of those ropes had been fixed over the previous 2 weeks by dedicated Sherpa rope-fixing teams. Those men had spent 8 to 10 hours a day in exposed, life-threatening positions, drilling ice screws into surfaces that could fracture without warning, hauling heavy coils of rope upward, and testing every single anchor under full body weight before trusting it with human lives. But Derek's post reached thousands of his followers, who liked it, commented on it, and praised his technical skill and thoroughness. By morning, the post had been screenshot and circulated through a Sherpa WhatsApp group used for coordinating logistics at Camp 2. The reaction was instantaneous and volcanic. He hadn't just failed to credit their work, he had stolen it outright, claiming their dangerous, backbreaking labor as his own personal achievement. To the Sherpas who had risked everything on that 3,000-foot face, this wasn't mere disrespect. It was theft of identity, erasure of their very existence. What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed and coordination, as if the response had been building for weeks. Around 9 o'clock in the morning, Sherpas began descending from higher camps, from the Lhotse face, from Camp 3 at 23,500 feet, from advanced positions where they had been pre-positioning gear for the summit window. They moved down the fixed ropes in tight, efficient groups. At first, clients and Western guides assumed some routine logistical issue had pulled them down. By 10:30, more than 60 Sherpas had gathered in an open area near the center of Camp 2. Their voices rose in animated Nepali as they talked and gestured. Word spread like wildfire that something extraordinary was happening. Expedition leaders who approached were told firmly that this matter concerned only the Sherpa community and the Canadian climber. They were to stay out of it. Derek learned what was coming when Dorge appeared at his tent shortly before 11. Dorge's face was calm, but his words were steel. The Sherpa community wanted to speak with him about the social media post. He needed to come out and address what he had written. Derek replied that he was resting and would talk later. Dorge repeated the request with greater urgency, warning that delay would only make things worse. Derek told him to leave and zipped the tent vestibule shut. Within minutes, the gathering swelled. What had been 60 men became 80, then over 100 as more Sherpas poured down from the Lhotse face and other parts of Camp 2. They formed a loose but unmistakable circle around Derek's tent, standing roughly 30 feet away, a human cordon that isolated him from the rest of the camp. Some carried ice axes, not raised in threat, but held with quiet readiness. The atmosphere had shifted from raw anger to something colder, more organized, and far more intimidating. The sun beat down on the western Coombe, turning the basin into a natural heat trap where temperatures climbed into the upper 20s. Yet the cold radiating from that circle of men had nothing to do with the weather. An American guide named Melissa Grant, camped just 50 yards away, would later describe the scene as unlike anything she had seen in 12 years on Everest. The Sherpas were not shouting or waving weapons. They simply stood there in formation, waiting in a silence that was more terrifying than any noise could have been. It spoke of control, unity, and absolute collective purpose. Other climbers had emerged from their tents and watched from safe distances in small, nervous groups. At approximately 11:15, Derek finally stepped out of his tent. He looked confused by the sheer number of people surrounding him and asked what was going on. The answer came from multiple voices at once, delivered in clear English for his benefit. He had lied about the rope work. He had stolen credit for their labor. He had disrespected their community repeatedly for weeks. They demanded a public acknowledgement and an apology. Derek's response only poured gasoline on the fire. He claimed the post had been misunderstood, that he hadn't said he installed all the ropes, only that he had checked them for safety. When several Sherpas calmly read the exact wording of his caption back to him from their phones, he pivoted again, arguing that social media was personal expression and none of their business. He added that he had paid substantial fees for their services and expected them to fulfill their contractual obligations without harassment. Those words hung in the thin air like a challenge. The circle of Sherpas tightened unconsciously, shrinking the space around him from 30 feet to 20, then closer still. Derek backed up against his tent, eyes darting for support. A few Western guides stood at the edge of the confrontation but made no move to intervene. Later interviews revealed their cold calculation. Derek had created this situation through his own repeated actions. Stepping in could destroy their own long-term relationships with the very Sherpa teams they depended on for future seasons. What happened next remains disputed in its exact details, but the outcome is brutally clear. Derek tried to retreat back into his tent. Several Sherpas moved forward to stop him, and physical contact began. Derek shoved one man backward. That Sherpa stumbled but stayed on his feet. In an instant, the entire group surged. Hands grabbed Derek's jacket and arms. He was yanked away from his tent and dragged toward the center of the circle. He screamed for help, calling out the names of other climbers, but no one moved. The violence lasted roughly 90 seconds. He was struck repeatedly in the face and body. He dropped to his knees on the ice. When he tried to rise, kicks sent him down again. Blood ran from a cut above his eye. His jacket tore at the shoulder. One glove was ripped off and lost in the crowd. Then, as suddenly as it had erupted, the assault stopped. The Sherpas stepped back and reformed their circle. Derek remained on his knees, gasping in the thin air. His face was already swelling on the left side. His breathing was rapid and shallow, each inhale producing a faint whistling sound. At 21,300 feet, where oxygen saturation is already critically low, the physical beating and adrenaline had pushed his body into acute distress. His hands trembled as he pressed one palm against the ice to steady himself. The demand that came next was delivered with calm, terrifying clarity. Derek had to leave the mountain immediately, not after resting, not after talking to his expedition leader, not after gathering his gear. Now, they would give him 1 hour to pack essential items and begin descending. If he was still at Camp 2 after that time, they would return and finish what they had started. The threat carried no shouting, only quiet certainty. Derek managed to stand on unsteady legs. He staggered back to his tent, briefly supported by one Western climber who had finally stepped forward. Inside, he assessed his injuries. His face was battered but not destroyed. The cut above his eye had clotted. His ribs ached on the left side, but he could breathe without stabbing pain. His hands shook violently, from cold, adrenaline, altitude, or all three. His oxygen saturation, had he checked it, would have been dangerously low. Hypoxia, stress, and the cognitive fog of extreme altitude were already clouding his judgment. In that impaired state, he made the decision that would kill him. Instead of descending slowly with support, instead of waiting for his expedition company to organize help, instead of coordinating with other climbers, Derek chose to flee immediately and alone. He stuffed a small day pack with the bare minimum: a water bottle, a few energy bars, his phone, his wallet, and a down jacket. He left behind his sleeping bag, stove, extra oxygen bottles, everything that could have kept him alive. At noon, he set off down the western combe toward Camp 1, moving far faster than his exhausted, injured body could safely manage at that altitude. The route between Camp 2 and Camp 1 stretches roughly 2.5 miles across the glacier, gentle in overall angle but riddled with hidden slots, snow bridges, and crevasses. Under normal conditions, with proper pacing and a rope team, it takes about 2 hours. Derek went alone, coordination failing, vision narrowing, thoughts fragmenting. His oxygen levels plummeted with every step. Around 12:40, roughly 1 mile below Camp 2, he stepped onto a snow bridge that looked solid but had been softened by afternoon warming. The surface temperature had risen into the teens, turning frozen snow into something treacherous. The bridge collapsed without warning. One moment he was walking, the next he was falling through empty air. Derek plunged 23 feet into a narrow crevasse before his body wedged tightly between the converging blue ice walls. The impact shattered his left femur midshaft. Several vertebrae in his lower back cracked. His head slammed against the ice, opening a deep gash across his scalp and knocking him unconscious for a time. When he came to, he was trapped. His broken leg sent white-hot waves of pain through him with every twitch. His back refused to obey. His arms were pinned. 15 feet above him, he could see the ragged slash of sky. His daypack, torn from his back during the fall, lay on a ledge 12 feet higher, visible yet completely unreachable. It contained his radio and emergency beacon. His shouts were weak, swallowed by the thin air and the ice. The temperature inside the crevasse was far below zero. Dressed for movement, not for lying motionless, Derek began losing heat rapidly. He was discovered 3 hours later by 2 Sherpas descending with equipment. They spotted the pack, investigated, and found him wedged below. He was already deep in hypothermia and hemorrhagic shock. Skin waxy, breathing shallow, consciousness flickering. A full rescue operation formed within minutes, but the geometry of the crevasse made every movement agonizingly slow. 6 Sherpas drilled ice screws, built a pulley system, and lowered a rescuer just far enough to thread webbing under Derek's arms. In short, controlled hauls, they fought the narrow pinch points until they dragged his body back into daylight. By then, his core temperature had plummeted to 86 degrees Fahrenheit and he was no longer responsive. Derek was carried down to Camp 1, staged for evacuation, and eventually helicoptered to Kathmandu for emergency surgery. He died on the operating table shortly after midnight on May 16th. The official cause of death was listed as traumatic injuries compounded by severe hypothermia and cerebral edema. He was 38 years old. Nepalese authorities and climbing organizations launched investigations. Witness statements were taken, but no criminal charges were ever filed. The reviews concluded that Derek's death resulted from his own decision to descend alone while injured and impaired by altitude, not from the confrontation itself. Within the mountaineering world, the event became known simply as the Camp 2 incident. a stark, whispered reminder of how quickly judgment collapses at extreme altitude and of the invisible lines that, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. The Sherpas returned to their work within days. The season continued. Everest filled once again with dreamers chasing the same summit that Derek Holden would never reach. And the mountain, as it always has, kept its secrets and its price.